would like to welcome you all to the first lecture in our 1980-81 lecture series, and hope to see you all here at the coming lectures. I'm very, very proud to have this first speaker here tonight, Hugh Hardy. Which one is he? This one? You are? Mr. Hardy is principal of the firm of Hardy, Holtzman, Pfeiffer in New York City. The firm was established in 1967. Before that, it was Hugh Hardy and Associates, which was formed in 1962. Mr. Hardy is a graduate of Princeton University with degrees in Master of Fine Arts in Architecture and Bachelor of Architecture, and was the D'Amato Prizeman at Princeton. He's a member of the I'm reading this because I'm just reading this part. I'm going to read this part. Don't embarrass me in front of everyone here. He's a member of the United Scenic Artists, local number 829, and he's been a member of that organization since 1958. He's advisor to the New York City Planning Commission. He has taught at Yale University as Charlotte Shepard Davenport Professor of Architecture with his partners, and has won numerous awards for excellence in architecture and urban design, including a 1978 Medal of Honor from the New York chapter of the American Institute of Architects, and the Brunner Prize in Architecture from the National Institute of Arts and Letters. The hecklers come in the last minute, and they always like to sit in front where they could be really difficult on the speaker, but I understand that, and we'll be able to cope with it. If I had to name a very few architects from the United States that I could easily say I'm very, very proud to introduce here in Muncie, Indiana, I would undoubtedly pick Hugh Hardy as one of those. I personally think the work that his firm is doing is extremely influential in architectural circles all around the world. And with no further ado, I'd like to say it's a real pleasure to have Hugh Hardy here come and lecture this evening. Hugh Hardy. Okay.
All right. I'm told the sound's bad here. That's my introduction. Can you hear through this bad sound? When you can't hear, let me know. I wanted to come talk with you about context. I wanted to come and discuss about how everything takes place in a context. I wanted you to be excited about being in a school of architecture. I wanted you to be curious. I wanted you to think it was a good thing to do. I wanted you to wonder about what architecture was, because it is made of many different things. I hoped I could suggest to you how big a subject it is. I also wanted to make clear that I think architecture, and I can't imagine any other definition, has to do with what's visible. And that because of that, what is invisible architecture? There are some smart things that might be said about architects practicing a form of invisible architecture at this moment. But leaving all that aside, that's always been true. Architecture deals with what's there, what you see. Anyone not curious about the world of what you see can't survive as an architect. But we're living in a peculiar time for people who are interested in those kinds of things. We do not live in a time where architecture represents a great challenge, either technologically or as an act of belief. It's, if anything, a kind of introspective time for architecture. But on the other hand, it's an introspective time for the country, too. There were times when the forefront of change and the most astonishing things everybody was interested in took place in architecture. When the citizens of Florence finally figured out how to leap over that great vault of space that was the center of their cathedral, which had stood unroofed for a generation. It was an architect that did it. When the great railroad stations of the 19th century came into being and the whole network of the trains that made so much of this country possible, they're right at the forefront of the whole business were people building buildings in unimaginable spans and extraordinary natures, things the world had never seen before. And to a certain extent, it was also true with airports in the 50s, when airports came into existence. They were bold, challenging things that only architects could figure out how to do, or so it seemed. That's not the case now. The most exciting things, the most extraordinary technology is probably what's happening in the military, and so much of it is a game of death. It's all about a different kind of perfection. I meant to bring, and I didn't, a slide about the MX missile, and that whole wonderful thing of the Underground Railroad. I've forgotten the cost. How many millions and millions of dollars is the MX missile, and how many miles of invisible railroads are going to be built trucking around these giant things? And all of the poisons that affect us now are also invisible. So much of what are of concerns at this point in time, so much of what the future is made out of, are really concerns which are invisible. I think the final irony of architecture and a society which has cut itself off from consideration of the planet, cut itself off from context, is the fact that air conditioning towers breed Legionnaire's disease. I've always been suspicious about buildings which were totally artificial in concept, because we really do live in a pretty glorious planet. And the arrogance of human beings say, I can do better than nature. In the long course of human events, there's always been some comeuppance. And I was amused to read in the paper this morning that a university in Vermont, 17 people have been killed by bugs coming out of the cooling tower in the medical part of the university. There's something very peculiar about all that, and everyone now, I think, recognizes it. So that although I could say, and sound cynical and sad, that you're coming into a world of architecture at a bad time, I don't think it's true at all. Certainly by comparison with when I was in school and what architecture was and how doctrinaire and short-sighted it was, this is a glorious time to be considering and to be interested in architecture. There are a few problems. I mean, we are still building environments with borrowed energy. We are still building environments in a fairly foolish way, and we are still victimized by all kinds of things which we'll never be able to pay back. But it's still possible to build in this society. Talk to people in Europe, talk to people in other parts of the world, and see how much we're admired for the fact that we sustain the wonderful act of faith called building. It's obviously a positive thing to do. I was trying to think of an example of buildings that were built to make the world worse, and I couldn't. I mean, you could say that jails are, but public funds jails, and the theory behind jails is that they're actually going to improve the inmates who live there, that the society is an attempt to encourage and to nourish. The business of making buildings is an extraordinarily confident thing to do. They take a long time, they're very expensive, and when they're done, the world is always different than when they began. So it's sort of like an act of fortune telling. But the best thing about them is that people do command those resources, suffer all that agony, go through all the enjoyment because they believe that there's going to be something better. Now, all buildings have context. Has to be true. And watch out, because buildings are not made on drafting boards. Buildings are not made out of design. Design is a part of what makes buildings, what makes architecture. All buildings have sites. A building sitting here is different than a building where I come from, as you'll see. A building even sitting 10 miles from here is going to be different than a building sitting right here. So that at the very least, all buildings have context because they're built somewhere. They also, which is much more important to what I would like to be able to explain this evening, they all take place in time. This building looks the way it does because of certain preoccupations that caused it to come into being. And you can recite them as well as I as you look around here. There were clearly certain ideas at work about technology, about the use of materials, about fashion, about how people should gather, about science too. There's a great deal of, and engineering. It's all written on these walls. And 10 years from now, this building will not be the same because it will represent something different because of the fact that the society that built this structure will view it differently. There isn't a building in America that still means the same as it did when it was built exactly. We were talking just a little bit ago about the 60s, and I can remember people with vehemence denouncing the United States Capitol because it was a symbol of oppression, and all those stairs were the proof that arrogant people built monuments to exclude humanity from its just deserts, and on and on and on and on. And of course, it's exactly the opposite reason to why those buildings have stairs. A third thing is that all buildings take place as a part of a language. And one of the great joys about architecture is that the more you get to do it, the more fun you can have reading the language of architecture. It is just as clear and succinct a language as the one we use to communicate. And I don't know if you ever thought about how astonishing it is that I could stand here and make noises and, to some extent anyway, convey images, ideas, meanings, impressions, and we could have some kind of shared ideas because of the fact I'm here making ritualistic sounds. That's language. The words mean different things, as these photographs will mean different things to different people, and buildings mean different things to different people. But all buildings take place in the context of construction, in the context of associations and social understanding that, of course, stretches back as long as people who've made buildings. The peculiar thing about American buildings, until recently, was that we're sort of children in this society of another century. In fact, almost 2 centuries ago, the 18th century. The origins of America have a lot to do with an extraordinary idea, which was that human beings were somehow innately perfectible, that there was the possibility of making human beings innately better, innately moral, innately good. And that coincided with the extraordinary discovery of this giant continent and its resources and all the rest of the story that you know. But the idea of perfectibility goes hand in hand with the idea of some kind of utopia. And America has always been a utopia, a thing where, unlike any other rest of the part of the world, things were possible. There is, of course, a tremendous responsibility that goes with the idea of being the chosen people in a utopia, as we are now discovering. And there also is an extraordinary amount of wastage and disconnection in the idea of progress, of perfectibility, if it assumes that the past is somehow inferior because we are now living in a better present. It's only within the last decade, I think, that the public has forced architects to challenge the idea in our sphere that old buildings are somehow inferior, that the new is always better. We, architects, like everyone else, rode through the American phenomenon of believing that the future was inherently better because people were going to be better, because we were making in the promised land something that had never existed before. Enough has happened in America in the last 2 decades to challenge all that, and I think it's to architecture's benefit, as you will see. I'm not positive that anything I can show you will be an example of an enduring architecture. I am now old enough to have had my first building torn down. It's sort of a badge of honor to discover that our work is being erased at the other end as fast as we're putting it up at the front end. And I don't think that's, in the sense that architecture is a language, I don't begrudge that at all. What is important, however, is to get some sense of the work that we do taking place in this shared context of place and time and language. And I couldn't think of a better way to do it than to be so personal as to show you some of my own context. Let's see what happens, which is left and which is right. That's left and that's right. I have to get organized here. Come on. There we are. Now we've gone too far. There we are. I've got right and left. Victorian families were very secure in themselves. There even were special kinds of clothes for special ages, and special postures, and special places, and special chairs, and special organizations, and special words, and everything was a codified structure. Even as late as the 30s, in this wonderful series of photographs from Fortune magazine showing how people who worked for the phone company played at home, and how benign the telephone company was because it gave an opportunity for people to live as you see on the right. You can still notice a very structured sense of family, a very structured sense of people's roles. We are now given an image, which on the left I think is more image than reality, of everybody is sort of open and free to live as they choose in any way. And these distinctions are blurred. There isn't that much difference between how parents address children and vice versa. We're somehow all together in one general, generous continuum. I think of this in the case of our own children. You'll see here on the left my daughter playing with a pal, and there we were in Italy. Now, do you think that she was aware of the context of that trip? I don't believe so at all. She certainly is more aware of the idea of fantasy that we're so much inured with. We all wish to be people we're not. Here she is at Halloween. And for her, the context of that moment was probably far more important. Here they are, daughter and son. My own daughter wishing that she were a ballerina at age 5, and my son wishing he were a box of frozen peas. I don't know why he wished he was a box of frozen peas. It's always been a great high point in his life, and we have a great deal of discussion about remember the night you were the box of frozen peas. But the whole ritual of special clothes and special occasions that something like Halloween represents is very much a part of certainly their lives and our lives together. Here are some photographs of the office in which I worked 15 years ago. It's very strange. I dug them out to see what would happen if I stood up in public in front of these photographs, and this was something called an office picnic. In a way I cannot explain, these early memories of that office and this now destroyed place that was that office are as much a part of what we do as the physical place that's there today. There were many habits and many ideas and many states of being that were created at that point, this is now 10 years ago, that are still very much with us. It's led us, I think, in our work to become curious about this time machine of architecture. And here is a little project that's a special favorite of mine, although we've never succeeded in getting anyone to publish it, because we've always been criticized because the furniture wasn't contemporary. The whole point of the story, and it's a little anecdote, being that here's a woman you see on the left standing in the autumn of in front of her home. And here is the entrance hall behind that front door. She lived obviously in a very well-appointed, gracious home, but her husband had died, her children had moved away. If she entertained, she had to walk half a mile, it seemed to her, from the kitchen to the dining room to the living room to even offer a Ritz cracker and an ice cube. So she wanted to move. She wanted out. She had had enough of this place. It had served its purpose. But on the other hand, she didn't want to give up all the family associations that were so much a part of her life. She saw no reason why she should have to take away all of these things. Now, these are photographs of an almost museum-like Westchester living room. I mean, there's almost everything is exactly the way it ought to be. The bridge lamp, the chairs, the table, the overstuffed furniture, all of it is fairly nondescript, but very, very much filled with the associations of this woman's life, and she saw no reason to abandon it. And she asked, was it necessary? And she's a very properly strong-willed lady. In fact, she didn't ask the question. She said, it is not necessary for me to give up these things. Can you make me a contemporary house, because I want such a thing, without stripping me, in effect, of all of my associations? And of course, that was the challenge. The geometry that makes this house is a whole other part of the story. And in fact, the plan is a biaxial plan where you go in the front door and you wish to proceed straight ahead, but you can't, and you move to the left and right, and over the top of that, there's some funny, ill-tempered roofs that come down in the wrong direction. But the real point of the story is that we were able to make for her an environment which, by night or by day, took all of the objects and all of the things that were hers and put them in a contemporary context. From my point of view, immodestly, I think things look even better than they did before, and yet nothing has changed. She did not buy one piece of furniture. They're all unexpected and unusual juxtapositions that occur with the everyday objects of Levi von Berners' daily life. Here's the other extreme of an entire community owning large pieces of furniture. This is a blast furnace in Birmingham, Alabama. In the foreground, you see something called a Sloss furnace. It was, Birmingham was built on steel because of the railroads came to town and crossed there because there was not only iron ore, but also limestone and coke available right in the region. So you had all the three ingredients of making steel. Although the ore was not particularly high grade, the proximity of those raw materials was so great that it became a very valuable manufacturing center. And this furnace was in operation until 10 years ago, when it was closed down by environmental legislation, and had become so much a part of everyone's life. They used to sit up on the viaduct and watch when the furnaces were tapped and the molten pig iron ran out and into little piglets. And the whole romance and lore of what built this community was there. And it's the pre-TV, people would come and sit in the viaduct and watch there made the capital wealth of the region. But an astonishing thing has happened, because in its abandonment, it has become as luxurious and in nostalgia a place as I have ever seen. If you go to ruined abbeys in England and contemplate the Middle Ages, you couldn't have a more amazing experience than wandering around through these industrial ruins. You think a great deal about America, you think about all of us, you think about iron and steel, you think about the irony of the fact that what built this place is steel, but the oxides and the chemicals and the rust and so forth at work are actually destroying the very, what built it is destroying because the acids here are prodigious, and so that how you protect the furnace from eating itself up is a physical problem of great magnitude. And it's just an unbelievable thing to experience, especially, as you're aware, for architects who have fooled around with industrial imagery and the industrial language from time to time. This has extraordinarily rich associations. And here is an entire community, in effect, through a bond issue, saying, what shall we do with this? How shall we make this into something that will endure? The obvious answer has been so far, we'll make it into a cultural center. That is not yet defined, though, and I can't tell you tonight what that means, although that's the official designation. But what does one do with this industrial landscape? It was never intended to be used by man in the sense that you would populate it. You can't have lectures in a furnace. You can't slide around in those pipes. What does one do with it? And yet it's far too powerful, far too valuable to throw away. Now, there are planar things that you can do, and I could discuss the geometry of organization here, showing you the furnace in one corner and access in another, and about ideas of layered organization. And I can show you presentation models, and we can discuss the baggage and the hardware of design. But the true answer is yet to be located. Here's a project in North Carolina, one that pleases me, although it amuses me too. It's filled with ironies. This is a Baptist church, and you'll see on the left the building before, and you'll see on the right the building after, and you will also find a contemporary building nestled next door. The church was going to be torn down and was to become a parking lot for an adjacent library, and it was saved and has been converted to use as a theater. And the building on the left is new public space, and this whole thing forms part of a larger complex. But what's interesting to me is how differently the symbols and associations of this Baptist church were for the community in North Carolina than they were for us. Let me try and explain. Here is what is now the stage, which had been the altar, and you can see moving around above a juxtaposition of the kinds of catwalks and things one needs in a theater. But the stained glass is still there, still intact, and the community celebrated it, thought it was a wonderful idea to come into a room where there was the Lord with raiment streaming coming down right over at 7th row center. Also, on the right-hand side, in the new space, you will see the baptismal font in marble. It's the only marble in the building. It was re-erected, and that forms the box office. And when I tell people in New York about all this, they are shocked. You would think you can't shock people in New York with anything. They are genuinely amazed by the blasphemy of doing all this, that you couldn't take the baptismal font, turn it into the box office. You would have to selectively remove portions of the stained glass, so it wasn't specifically the Lord, God, Jehovah anymore, but just a kind of rather amusing pattern of leaves. And yet the people in this community of Charlotte are very proud. And opening night, a woman came up to me right in front of that box office and shook my hand and said, "Young man, I'm so proud of what you've done. I was baptized here, and it's so good to see this place being used." I also wanted to share with you, this is a parenthesis, but it's just, I'm particularly amused, can't do it anymore, this business of materials, because we attempted to unify the new building with the old by some stylistic devices of stripes, and we chose to use glass brick, which you see on the right. These are chunks of brick. They're made for prisons. They're made for the windows of prisons because you can't beat your way out through a solid glass wall. But in fact here, if you take something out of context, you can use it decoratively. I guess it's the other side. And you notice to some extent that the lights are not on, but you can see what happens on the indoors when those things become illuminated structure. Here's another example of layers of history. This is Madison, Wisconsin, which is a remarkably vigorous community because it houses both a great state university and the state capitol, and a fierce populace. There's something about the long, cold winters. They have really nothing better to do all winter long than get together and argue about politics, and they do they ever. Everything in Madison is a political act. The state capitol is itself a remarkable building because it is a cross set on the diagonal within a square grid, which generates diagonal avenues, one of which you see on the right is State Street. And you'll find more in its heyday, State Street in the photograph on the right, where you see the Orpheum Theater, which is part of this anecdote. Here you see the Orpheum on the left and the Capitol on the right. And if you looked at the Capitol Theater, looking at the Capitol done by George Post, and for goodness sakes, if you're ever in Madison, Wisconsin, don't fail to see that building. If you want to see one of the most secure Beaux-Arts structures in America, you just get in there and look around. It's astonishing what people used to know how to do. If you look in the opposite direction in the right in the 20s, you're staring down State Street towards the university. Now, in the 20s, when these photographs were taken, this major thoroughfare connected the seat of power, which was the state government, to some sort of ramshackle university down there by the lake. In the course of time, the seat of power is almost reversed to the extent that in terms of ideas and true authority, the university has almost exceeded the state legislature in importance, and this kind of wonderful warfare that goes on there, I think, in many ways quite healthy. You'll see the Capitol Theater on the left, and just after that, a department store and a few other buildings, which are the point of this story. I keep saying story. I don't mean to be telling stories, but I guess they are in a way. Here is the Capitol in its prime, again in the 20s, and it shows you on the right a Jackie Coogan festival, when all the kids came as lookalikes to see if they could win the prize to be Jackie Coogan in the Jackie Coogan Festival. So clearly this was something that had great public enthusiasm, and it was, of course, a fantasy. It was as amazing a place to be, and as amazing for the citizens of Madison as Penelope dressing up at Halloween as a princess. People came from miles and miles around to indulge in not exactly a Spanish experience, although it was claimed that this was a Spanish interior. It's really a Southern California Spanish interior, somehow washed up on the shores of northern Wisconsin. And you see here the architect's rendering of the original with these vaguely Spanish shops on the right. And you'll see on the left what came of it all as we took that building plus a department store plus some infill and sort of, what's the right word, melded it together so that you could have a major civic center as such as you see on the left. And I wanted you to be sure and see the rear end, because the rear end is as important to the community because of its bulk as any other, and to have some explanation that there was care spent here as well. But the point of all this is to say that by no stretch of the imagination could that movie theater be regarded as an excellent piece of architecture, something without parallel, something distinguished in the history books, a fine pedigree by art historians. Nonsense. But it's the only one like it in town. It's the only time in the history of that community that the mad notions of Southern California so directly penetrated Main Street. They now come indirectly through television and penetrate all of us, but there was the built testament to an idea of Spanish fantasy that would never again be created, and it seemed to us it was an important part of that community and worthy, in this case, of direct preservation. And there it is, restored, resplendent. Not exactly the way it was, because we had to sweeten it up a little. No one would accept it on its original terms. But there is an architectural assignment. At the same time, here is an architectural assignment. These are the public spaces which connect that interior to two others, three others actually, five others. These are brand new spaces made out of the intersection of existing buildings. And you'll see on the right the department store transformed into an art center, and on the left the rather easy relationship that it had being a department store with the street, and you get some sense of the various levels. In addition, here's a brand new room with a completely different architectural vocabulary, certainly the kind of thing that would have been forbidden when I was in school, because it was an absolutely wrong idea to make one building out of more than one vocabulary. Here's a building that's speaking in several tongues at once. And in fact, in some extent, it's quite jarring. The juxtapositions are so great. On opening night, it was fun to sort of stand around and listen to people's comments, and how those who like the restored building would say, oh, this is so nice. I mean, there's nothing like it. Why, they just don't do this anymore. It certainly beats contemporary architecture. And then there would be people standing in what they consider, quotes, contemporary architecture, saying, oh man, this is really great. It sure beats that old Prague stuff inside. And here was a building appealing at several different levels. This is another example of context. It's slightly different community. This is Los Angeles. This is a project in endless formation, I guess you would say. What I will show you is one little tip of an iceberg. They're probably, although this particular example is not going to be built due to the winning of a competition by a competing development firm. But I think that some of the ideas at work here may yet be seen in Los Angeles. At least it's my hope. It's a wonderful community. It's as unlike any other in America I know. And here is the heterogeneous stuff of Los Angeles. A lot of fun is made of that place because of the business of these weird juxtapositions. It is, in fact, somehow the premier community in which everybody could fulfill the American dream of owning their own home, having their own front yard, their own backyard, their own barbecue, their own swimming pool, at the giant urban sprawl that is Los Angeles. And it has really, I mean, there's nothing you can't do there. It is an extraordinarily made-up environment. This was a museum for contemporary art as a development proposal in a larger context of high-rise buildings, which were designed by a gaggle of contemporary architects. And our assignment was to take a small, really tiny little building and somehow give it prominence within this this thing that is Los Angeles. And I would be presumptuous to say I understand what the community of Los Angeles represents, but it certainly has powerful associations for me. What we chose to do was to take a very conventional idea of what a museum is, just a series of layers joined by, in this case, escalators, as you see rising up there in section. But we encased it in a way that it implied it was in motion, because it was set diagonally to the grid of the street and set diagonally to the grid of the rest of the project, which I'll show you in a moment. And the fact that it was also cantilevered made it have unusual dynamism. Is that a word? It made it unusually dynamic. Now that was, of course, what we wanted to do so that we could set it apart from the rest of the composition and give it specific identity. On the other hand, it was a very dangerous thing to do because the museum people had not yet decided what their identity was to be. They didn't know what contemporary art meant. They knew they didn't want to create a museum of modern art, but what image, what sense of themselves should be projected? And in these kinds of development work projects, that's always difficult. Here you see on the right the result of this, I guess it's like fishing. You put something on your hook and see what bites. This was a serious proposal in the sense that we could build it, but it was not a serious proposal in the sense that we knew more about the Contemporary Art Museum in Los Angeles than the people themselves. This was a way of saying, we can make your building special. It was, of course, not thought of as in those terms. It wasn't thought of as abstract exploration. It was thought of literally. And this building that you see on the right was designed, although in general awareness of what the other members of the team were doing, and I should count for you, just for your own amusement, the other members of the team. But here is a hotel done by the Mexican architect La Garreta. Here is this funny building of ours. This is a high-rise structure done by a local architect with some help, let's say, by Caesar Pelli. Here is Caesar Pelli's building rising behind here. This was the structure by Barton Myers, who was organizing and orchestrating this whole adventure. And here is a whole urban set of terraces and plazas designed by Charles Moore and Larry Halprin. And then ricocheting down the hill something was funicular, which led to a space done by Frank Gehry with some more housing by Charles Moore. So that ought to do for name dropping. And the point of this exercise was for us, as I say, to find some specific way of setting our building apart. But when the renderings were made, and when the design was published, and the final, you know how competitions are, there's a great deal of work, and you finally finish, and you find out what you've done. It was said that our design idea had been to make this building look as though it had fallen off that building as a result. and that therefore we were being impudent in making fun of earthquakes in Los Angeles. Which is absolutely untrue. This is a project in St. Louis, which was built at the time of the World's Fair there. The Chicago World's Fair had been such a spectacular success, and St. Louis was feeling so proud and full of itself, and so assured that it said, we'll do better. And in America of those years, better axiomatically meant bigger. So they built the World's Fair half to twice the size. I've forgotten the acreage, but it was almost twice the size of that in Chicago. It was something so large you couldn't conceivably have gotten around it in less than 3 days by any means of vehicles. And there were these extraordinary structures, all made out of plaster and wood, you'll see in a moment. And lurking behind here, those three gables, are the one, they belong to the one building that was built to last, the St. Louis Art Museum. And this was the first extensive use of electric illumination at night. It was further distinguished because it came in colors, so the buildings could fade with dimmers, which were a brand new invention at this scale, from one color to another. And the waters were even illuminated. No one had ever seen anything like it. These are the people who built it. This is what these people did to the landscape. Although it's a great park now, and also spawned a great university, George Washington University, these people were absolutely ruthless in setting about what they had to do. And the fact that they destroyed a landscape didn't concern them, because they knew they were going to create a better landscape. And they did. In many ways, they did. What they replaced, and through extraordinary efforts, is in many ways far superior to what St. Louis would have had as a park had they not had the exposition. And it was inherent in the idea of the exposition to complete and finish it, not as buildings, but as a great urban park. And here you see this fantasy city that was thrown up in a year and all made out of bits and pieces of plaster stuck onto wood. All of these buildings were, in fact, myths, if you will. And being Americans, we figured out how to do it fast. Mass production came into play. We could mass produce art. We could mass produce walls. We could really get in there and do it quick. The result of all this was the building on the right. Now, it had a strange history, because Cass Gilbert came from New York and was appointed to design the most distinguished buildings at the fair, which crowned something called Art Hill. And this colonnade you see extending off to the left was placed, and there was one which went symmetrically to the right. This and the giant dome that you saw earlier were all his original concept, placed in front here of the museum, so that this structure sat just over here behind all of this carrying on. Somehow, through the politics of the fair, Gilbert lost the commission, although he did the plan, for these crowning buildings, and was only able to do the art museum itself. And a local fellow took care and produced the largest pipe organ in the world, and the largest this and that and the other, and so forth. Gilbert sulked and was very upset by all this, and so he deliberately turned this building around and made it blind on this side, so that when you walked into his building, you could not see anything that this local architect had done. And all the windows opened out to the landscape that Gilbert could control, which was in the opposite direction to the west. It happens to be absolutely rotten orientation for works of art, because the sunlight is deleterious, and you wouldn't do that. You would open windows to the north, but Gilbert wasn't about to have the public looking at someone else's work. So that inherent in the plan of this structure is a kind of game of spite, of professional jealousy. Here is what I'm speaking of, is that all of this structure here was erected And it sort of was, every time Gilbert looked at it, I guess he felt that it was rubbing in the fact that he'd lost this big prize. Inside was this giant hall called Sculpture Hall. It was built at a time when Americans were unsure of their own art and therefore felt that you could be uplifted only by things from Europe, and we couldn't afford to carry them here. So we made plaster casts, and the hall, as on the left, is a photograph taken in the 30s, but if you looked at the original photograph, you would see the place just crammed with plaster casts of bits and pieces of antiquity from all over the world. Here you see it in the 30s on the left, and above the tile vaults of the place as they appeared originally. Now, the foundations for this museum are a little quixotic. There are some very unfortunate water and clay conditions in one corner of the major hall, which is 90 feet tall. So that slowly but surely, the southeast corner of this building is slipping away imperceptibly. I mean, it'll probably take another generation for the cracks to grow sufficiently that one would become alarmed. And as we did our own structural analysis, it became clear that we didn't have to worry. Time, one might have to worry. But the slippage and the movement of this thing caused the tiles in the ceiling to fall off and hit people in the head as they came to view works of art. So the trustees of the museum in the late 30s felt that was not supportable, and they stitched the whole vault together with steel and then sprayed it with gunite, so that obviously the character of the room was completely changed. And you'll see on the right the way we found it. Another part of the puzzle is that well-meaning but certainly unfortunate additions were applied to the building as programs changed. And you see here on the right a kind of clearly 50s. You can tell instantly that's 50s from the canopy that's trying to fly and from that particular glazing pattern. And that is the entrance to an auditorium that's chunked right smack on, just off, in fact, axis of the major south facade of the building, in as unfortunate a relationship as there could be. And here you see on the left the principal facade, which is the opposite side of the building, indicating what kind of control the building ought to have. So, part of our assignment was to untangle all these site conditions and to ensure that one could approach the building and use it more sanely. Part of our assignment was to strip away and erase some of these layers of time. But of course, that's a perilous exercise, because when do you stop? You can't really ever restore a building because you cannot recreate time. But you could certainly use the building more respectfully to its original purpose. One of the things we did was to stop or to meliorate Gilbert's game of spite, and we took his blind niches and fenestrated them, so that when you're in the building for the first time, you can look out into the park. If you wish to, you can imagine the great plaster buildings that were once there, but they, of course, have gone. And they were really only a problem to Mr. Gilbert. And they certainly, it's foolish to penalize citizens who are now in St. Louis because of the professional games that went on 70 years ago. On the left, you'll see a gallery almost in its original condition, but you will also see some very peculiar ideas of how to hang works of art. Double hanging is certainly not admired in most cases, and when the building opened, there was triple hanging up here. Also, there are all these maidens running around, holding garlands in this absolutely wonderful Art Nouveau frieze. There was absolutely no possibility that we could restore such a thing. It would be hooted down as inappropriate to the display of serious works of art. And it's a funny building that way, because it is a sort of a mix of Victorian and Beaux-Arts ideas. All American buildings tend to be eclectic that way. Here's the same room on the right, a little corner of it, as it was originally. And here on the left is what was happening in the 30s as casework appeared. And you can see the same ladies are there, but they're getting pretty tired. But the frieze is still in place. What to do with a room like this? The answer is coming up. In the case of the big hall, it seemed as though there was no way that one could restore it in the sense that we could physically recreate the basket work that was the ceiling. We had to somehow bring it into harmony with itself, and we had to complete it in a way that it never had been. Being a World's Fair structure, there never had been the money to encrust it with marbles and the kind of ornament that would have been appropriate in the period. And so we used layers of paint and various values and various textures and so forth to indicate light and shade, and transformed its lighting by both day and night. In the room, the galleries I was showing you, we made no attempt to restore the ladies, but what we did do was to restore the axes, so that in this photograph taken when we inherited the building, you see that you would go down a principal axis into a dark medieval hole. We opened up the building, this is looking in the opposite direction, so that you were always aware of the kind of organization that Gilbert intended. And although this is the original molding work, we have changed somewhat the scale of the room by making it larger for the larger scale of paintings that the museum now owns. So, yes, we think it's appropriate, but no, it isn't a literal recreation of what was there. Here is on the left a slide of an area when we inherited it, which had been cut off from natural light since there had been so many problems. You see the windows here. And there were real pieces mixed up with fake things, which was very much in the vogue of museums in the 20s. Real, genuine works of art, it was felt would radiate consciousness better if they were put in a setting which was similar to the period, so that there was a general, if you had a Gothic cross, you put it in the Gothic chapel. Even if the Gothic chapel was made out of styrofoam, that was still a good thing to do, or the 20s equivalent of styrofoam. That idea is definitely in disrepair in the museum world, and so we had the opportunity here to bring back the natural light and to create a sculpture gallery. Now, that's just a hurried sketch to indicate that any institution takes place in time, and when one gets involved with restoration, there's some very tricky assignments of interpretation. I don't believe that there is any ultimate truth about how to do that. The scientific method does you know, you can take all the paint samples, you can do all the irradiation tests, you can figure out all the actual facts of what used to be, but you can never recreate the buildings as they once were, because in fact we ourselves cannot be the same. Our eyes are used to light levels and colorations and movement and juxtapositions, if you will, that are just not possible. You can't wash us of all those associations. If you truly restored a building, furthermore, it'd be illegal, because it would be too dark and it would have the wrong egress and 70 other things that are part of contemporary fact. Here is another more gentle version of dealing with buildings in an institutional setting. This is a secondary school in New Hampshire, St. Paul's, in Concord, the capital. And you see, it has got the funny assortment of buildings. Now, I know that people who go to St. Paul's think that it has a Gothic campus, but it has an everything campus. It's got Victorian buildings. It's got what are really pretentiously and vaguely Greek buildings. But what really distinguishes the site is an extraordinarily sensitive understanding of the land. Olmsted did the site planning for the school, and he of all planners was someone who was not of a bent to use the cookie cutter approach to how you made an institutional setting. And he always set buildings along contours. This happens to be a segment to show our building of a huge, actually huge dish. And all around this dish are set buildings at the same contour, even though they're of disparate styles because they all have various sloping roofs. They fit together. It's an extraordinary lesson in how important the physical site is. And you'll see here, I was being very snide about the poor Greek Revival buildings. It's because they're sort of plywood Greek Revival buildings. But this structure and this structure that you see here are this structure and this structure. This hip roof fellow is this fellow here, which shows you how much architects' models always lie. But that's all right. Remember that they do. Remember the camera lies as well. Anyway, here you'll see our two buildings, which are nothing more than a borrowed, vaguely industrial vocabulary with monitors and the high roofs of industry, put in concert with some buildings here by Ed Barnes in his most abstract geometry period, and although they are made of brick with some very handsome copper roofs, and buildings here of a Gothic Revival character. Now, how on earth could you meld all that together? What would you do? And this is in fact our solution. That it is contemporary to the extent that clearly there is a juxtaposition. I keep saying that word. Must be a synonym, please. A synonym for juxtaposition. A comparison here. No, it's not the right word. Anyway, you can see how a borrowed New England industrial vocabulary fits well in with this campus, and how the scale, and you also get a sense here of the great dish of land that lies beyond. I'm not sure I can explain with photographs how important the siting of these buildings are, but take it on faith that that's what makes this work. And it's far more important, really, than the materials themselves or this rather wise business of corrugated materials opposed to brick. And look, when you see the interiors, there's no question at all that this is something that was not designed 20 or 30 years ago. Here is a final juxtaposition. It is this case of best products. This is an extraordinary project because we have had the opportunity to invent a building which grows, and then we said, wouldn't it be wonderful if you could invent a building that changes as it grows? Wouldn't it be nice? Because when you build a building in stages, the parts that follow are always different. The client needs always to make some adjustment in program. No matter how carefully master planned any project is, if it's built sequentially in a set of phases, 2 years later, 5 years later, 5 minutes later, there are different needs just from the using of the building. So here it seemed that this building was going to become part of its own history, if you will, and that it was appropriate for it, as you can see by now, we would believe it was appropriate for it to have more than one aspect, so that the automotive geometry of giant curves and sitting here by the freeway and all that was perfectly appropriate. And you have to arrive in a corporate headquarters by car and have a giant parking lot. But at the same time, there's a whole other kind of profile which relates to the landscape of a really extraordinarily beautiful Virginia countryside. Not virgin stands of timber, but practically in their size. And certainly several generations worth of trees. Geometrically, it's different than this portion, and it has given us the opportunity to switch functions around as the client's needs have changed. Here you see, these are still in construction, so that I can't show you the amusement and the amazement of the water course as it spouts forward at the base of the building. But here you see the fairly, fairly non-committal facade that doesn't tell you much about what's behind it. In fact, it's very difficult to tell what scale it is. You don't know that that's a two-story building. And seen at night from the highway, it has the strangest sort of illusion, because of the height of the glass block wall, of being something that came from outer space. It had nothing to do with our intention, but there is something about that crosses your mind about strange encounters when you see this thing blowing at you. Part of it is the sparkle of this view pattern. Those are clear, transparent blocks set in a general field of translucent blocks. And you can see some kind of historical, I suppose, associations, although that wasn't the direct intent, because we have a top and a bottom. I think you have the fun now of being able to put a top on a wall. If it hangs out, someone might say it's a cornice, but I don't think you have to get all nervous about the fact that a wall can have a top on it. There are lots of reasons to do it. Some of them relate to rather practical matters of getting the water off the wall. And now, because of a freer world of architecture, one's able to have a bottom on a building. I don't think that means that you have to rush to the copybooks and consider yourself dealing with some century other than what we are, but we do have the opportunity to use a wider vocabulary, and of course these things have associations with the past. The same is true on the interior. Here goes the glass block wall curving around, and as it curves you can see each time it creates different openings. And there's no reason why that cannot come together in this case with an extraordinarily aggressive collection of contemporary art. You can imagine that one could have a carpet designed by an artist, Jack Beale, which could serve as part of the actual landscape itself, so that as the greatest pleasure due to the extent of the contemporary art collection of the clients in this case is that you really begin to wonder, and it's something about the nature of contemporary art, everything becomes art. If you take your coat off and hang it on a chair, you start looking at it because maybe it isn't your coat, or if you see something unexpected. If you come in the front door, there's a bag with neon in it, and it looks as though someone's thrown away a lot of neon, but it's actually a neon sculpture. Those wonderful surprises and discoveries are very much part of this environment, which would not clearly relate to any other point in time, because art was special and hung on walls and must be separated from what's around it. Now, that's Sydney's favorite little corner. I think I'm done. I just wanted you to see the view out my window. When I sit in my office and the sun goes down, that's what I look at. That's my garden. Those are my water tanks. That's my pollution. That isn't to say better or worse. It's just to say that clearly the context within which this work takes place is being influenced by the city that we live in. And clearly the architects and the environment that produces our work is influencing us, hopefully benignly, I don't know. And clearly the general relationship that we have now to the idea of the past and the use of monuments, I don't mean the physical monuments so much as the monuments of architecture, I find that very healthy. I think it's very good that we have rediscovered some kind of context in architecture. But there are a tremendous number of decisions that are required now. I suspect that the quest for rules, that you could make a great architecture if you could just fill in sort of an invisible set of rules, that because architecture is craft, that idea has been broken. It's going to be much harder now for you to be an architect because you will have to make individual choices. And in the whole process of making architecture, which is irreversible because you start first with the question of what should something be, and then you have to figure out where would it go, and then you figure out what shape should it have, and then finally maybe what color is it. As that process goes on, there are a constant set of choices as the field of choices becomes narrower and narrower and narrower. And all of those choices take place in a language that has associations. I can't imagine anything better or more interesting for anyone to do, and I wish you all the best of luck with it. I hope whatever you do it with conviction, and I hope you'll do it with great care. Thank you.
Thank you, Hugh. Before you leave, we have a reception planned for Hugh at the Underwood Plantation. And I think there are maps posted that tell you how to get there. But before you leave, I would like to honor a few special guests that we have here with us. We have from Columbus, Indiana, a gentleman who has worked with Mr. Hardy on a number of projects and represents the Cummins Engine Corporation, whose foundation was also very generous to the students who went with me to China last spring, Mr. Tom Harrison and his wife from Columbus. And I would like to ask him to stand and to thank them for honoring us with their presence this evening. Mr. Harrison was also on the member of the Board of Trustees of this university. And we have some local people here from Muncie, Mr. Edmund and his wife, Virginia Ball, Edmund and Virginia Ball, and we're very happy to have them here too. I think you should meet some of the people who came here to meet Mr. Hardy, and I'd like to ask them to stand so you can meet them, Edmund and Virginia Ball. Finally, those were our special guests. We have some very special guests that I would like to introduce you to now. We have 3 students. We actually have 4 students, but one's just joining Hugh's firm. We have 3. We have John Ish, who's now in Polyarch in Europe, who has worked for Hugh Hardy. And if Hugh will rehire him, he may come back if he's willing to do it. And we have Carol Marion, who has graduated from this school. We have Jack Martin, who has graduated from this school. And Mr. and Mrs. Marion are here, and Mr. and Mrs. Martin are here, and Mr. and Mrs. Ish are here. And their kids now work for Hugh, and they came to ask you for a raise for their kids, but we're really honored to have them here. And I'd like to ask them to stand, please. In an effort to save time, because this reception has been planned, I think we won't take any questions, and we'll keep all the questions for the reception, if that's all right with you. We thank you very much for taking time to come here. We invite you all to the reception afterwards, and thank you for coming. Good night.